Hey guys, welcome back. When we picture a medieval castle, we usually imagine thick stone walls, high towers, and the drama of a siege. But the quieter question is often the most revealing. When the gates were shut, the fires burned low, and the servants finally stopped moving through the corridors. Where did people actually sleep? And how did anyone rest at all in a building designed as much for war as for living? If you enjoy calm, long-form history that takes familiar places and makes them feel real again, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next deep dive. And it helps this kind of careful, educational storytelling keep finding the right audience. Now, let's step inside a medieval castle at night and see what going to bed really meant. Sleeping in a medieval castle was not a single experience. It depended on rank, wealth, region, season, and the century you're imagining. A stone fortress in the early Middle Ages is not the same as a late medieval palace castle designed for comfort as well as defense. Still, beneath all the variation, one truth holds steady. Sleep in a castle was shaped by the same forces that shaped everything else there. Security, hierarchy, and the constant effort to manage cold, damp, smoke, noise, and human movement inside a crowded, working household. To understand the night, you have to understand the building. A castle was a machine with many moving parts. By day, it stored grain, weapons, tools, and records. It fed people, housed animals, received guests, administered justice, and projected authority. At night, it did not simply close. Fires still needed tending, late arrivals might still come to the gate, and some spaces stayed active for practical reasons. There were always vulnerable points to watch: doors, posterns, walls, and stores. The castle's nighttime routine was never only about rest. It was about controlled quiet, supervised darkness, and the maintenance of order. In many castles, the heart of communal life was the Great Hall. This wasn't a romantic banquet room so much as a flexible public space. Eating, meetings, announcements, sometimes work, and in certain contexts, sleeping. In earlier periods especially, the hall could be where many members of the household slept, particularly lower status retainers, servants, and sometimes soldiers. Even in later centuries, when private chambers became more common among elites, the hall still symbolized the castle as a community, not merely a residence. When the day's activity ended, the hall would change character. Tables might be cleared, the fire banked, and bedding brought out for those who slept there. The same room that had been bright with food and conversation could become, by candlelight, a shared dormitory shaped by rank and custom. Above and beyond the hall were the private rooms, chambers tucked behind doors, upstairs, and often beyond one or more guarded thresholds. A medieval bedchamber wasn't just a place to sleep. It could also be a receiving room, a space to conduct business, and a symbol of status. The lord's or lady's chamber was typically warmer, better furnished, and more controlled. It might have tapestries or hangings to reduce drafts and soften the echo of stone. The bed itself could be the most expensive piece of furniture in the room, sometimes in the entire household. Not because people were vain about beds, but because textiles were valuable, labor-intensive, and essential for warmth. The most famous image of elite medieval sleeping is the great bed with curtains, sometimes described as a canopy or tester bed. Those curtains were not a decorative afterthought. In a cold castle, curtains created a microclimate, trapping body heat and reducing drafts. They also offered privacy in a world where privacy was rare. Even an elite bedroom might not be truly private in a modern sense. Attendants could sleep nearby. Servants might come in to tend fires, carry chamber pots, or bring water. Guests might be lodged close enough that footsteps and voices carried through corridors. Curtains did what walls could not always do. They made a small, warm, more personal enclosure within a much larger space. And warmth mattered more than almost anything. Castles are notoriously difficult to heat. Large stone structures absorb cold and hold moisture. Windows, when present, could be small, glazed, shuttered, or left open to the air depending on resources and fashion. But even a closed window could leak wind. Fireplaces helped, yet their heat was localized. A large chamber might have a fire and still feel cold at the edges. That's why medieval sleeping involved layers. Linen next to the body, wool above, furs for the wealthy, blankets for everyone who could afford them, and sometimes additional coverings hung around the bed itself. In winter, people might wear sleeping caps or keep garments nearby. The idea of sleeping in minimal clothing for comfort is a luxury that assumes reliable heating. In many medieval castles, warmth was something you built around yourself. Bedding also reflects social rank in a direct, physical way. A high-status person might have a mattress stuffed with feathers or fine materials, covered with linen sheets, and topped with multiple blankets. Others slept on straw-filled mattresses, sometimes called pallets, or on sacks stuffed with cheaper materials. Straw and rushes were common because they were accessible and could be replaced. They also brought problems. They could harbor insects, become damp, and compress quickly. Cleanliness was work. Now there's another side to the castle at night. Sound. Stone amplifies footsteps. Doors creak. Animals, especially in earlier castle complexes, might be nearby, either within the outer precinct or in adjacent structures. Wind could whistle through cracks. Fires crackled. Servants moved. Someone coughed. A guard called out. The popular image of a castle as silent and still at night is misleading. Could be quieter than the day, but it was rarely silent. For those sleeping in communal spaces, especially the Great Hall, there was the shared noise of breathing, shifting bodies, and the occasional murmur when someone woke. Sleep would come in waves rather than in one perfect, uninterrupted block. Light was managed carefully. Candles and oil lamps were expensive and hazardous. Fire was both essential and dangerous, especially in buildings with wooden floors, roof structures, and plentiful textiles. Nighttime meant fewer lights, placed more deliberately, that created a distinctive atmosphere. Pockets of warm illumination, surrounded by darkness, with the sense that the castle narrowed after dusk into controlled pathways. Stairs, doors, passages, each one implying permission and authority. A servant carrying a light at night wasn't just moving. They were signaling that their movement was legitimate. Security shaped sleeping arrangements too. Castles were defensive structures, and even in peaceful times the household planned for threat. The Lord's chamber might be located in a more secure part of the castle, higher, deeper behind more doors. Keys were powerful objects. Locks existed, but they were not universal, and the ability to restrict access was as much social as mechanical. Guards might sleep near key entrances. Retainers might sleep in the hall partly because it kept them close to the lord, available if needed. In some castles, a porter controlled the gatehouse and the rhythms of entry and exit. The gate itself might be barred, and night watches organized in shifts. The castle's protective logic didn't stop when people went to bed. If anything, the night was when that logic mattered most. And then there's the question people often avoid, but which dominated real experience: sanitation. Castles had latrines, sometimes in towers or projecting structures, designed to drop waste away from living spaces. The details varied widely. Some castles had sophisticated arrangements. Others relied on simpler solutions. But even in the better cases, nighttime use could be unpleasant. Cold, dark passages, drafts, smells, the risk of slipping. For elites, chamber pots offered a practical alternative, handled by servants the next morning. For others, night might mean walking to a designated place or managing as best as possible. These realities aren't sensational. They're simply part of what it meant to live in a stone fortress built long before modern expectations of comfort. Food and drink also affected sleep. In many households, the evening meal was substantial, and the timing of meals shifted with daylight and season. Alcohol, ale, beer, or wine, depending on region and status, was common, often safer than questionable water supplies. But common doesn't mean constant drunkenness. It means that modest alcohol was integrated into daily life, including evenings, and that sleep could follow a routine of eating, prayer, and settling the household. The church's calendar and practices shaped nightly rhythms too. In Christian Europe, prayer marked time. Some households observed night prayers. Monastic communities, including those linked to castles through patronage or proximity, maintained structured patterns of waking and worship that influenced surrounding culture. Even for lay people, the idea that nighttime was spiritually charged, filled with vulnerability, temptation, and the need for protection was widespread. That could shape how people thought about the darkness, not only how they endured it. Sleep itself was understood differently. Medieval people did not necessarily imagine sleep as one uninterrupted 8-hour block, because daily schedules were tied to daylight, labor demands, and household routines. Waking during the night was not automatically treated as a crisis. It could be normal to rise briefly, tend a fire, say a prayer, check on a child, speak quietly, or simply shift position before returning to rest. In a communal sleeping space, that kind of segmented night was easier to accept because everyone else was living it too. The castle, with its watches and nighttime duties, almost encouraged a view of night as a managed interval rather than a complete shutdown. Children's sleep in a castle depended on rank and age. Elite children might sleep in nurseries or in chambers near caretakers, surrounded by servants responsible for their well-being. They could be safer from the cold than lower-status children, but not immune to illness or discomfort. In the broader household, younger servants or pages might sleep in shared spaces, close to where they would work at dawn. Apprenticeship-like arrangements meant that living and learning blended together, and sleeping near one's duties was part of discipline and readiness. Guests, too, changed the nighttime shape of a castle. Hospitality mattered. When a noble visitor arrived, sleeping arrangements might be rearranged quickly. The best chamber went to the most important guest. Others were placed according to rank. Temporary bedding might fill rooms that were ordinarily used differently. A busy castle could become crowded, and crowding altered everything. Noise, air quality, the ability to keep spaces warm. The castle staff made all of this possible. If you slept in comfort in a medieval castle, it was because someone had been working for hours beforehand. Someone gathered fuel. Someone carried water. Someone aired bedding. Someone cleaned rushes or replaced them. Someone repaired a latch so a door would close properly against drafts. Someone kept the fire alive long enough that the chamber was not freezing when you entered. And someone, often multiple people, remained partially awake through the night, because in a castle there was always something that could go wrong. What's remarkable is that, over time, castles did evolve toward greater comfort, not because medieval people suddenly became more civilized, but because political stability, wealth patterns, and architectural ideas shifted. As threats changed, some castles became less purely military and more residential. Private chambers multiplied. Windows grew larger in some contexts. Fireplaces improved. The boundary between fortress and palace blurred. Yet even then, the essential medieval truth remained. Comfort was never evenly distributed. A castle at night was a map of hierarchy. Where you slept, what you slept on, how warm you were, whether you had curtains, whether you had privacy, whether you were expected to wake for duty, these were not personal lifestyle choices. They were social facts. So when you imagine sleeping in a medieval castle, it helps to picture not a single bed in a romantic tower room, but a whole building settling into its nighttime pattern. The last embers glowing in the hall. A servant quietly crossing a corridor with a covered candle. A guard shifting his weight near a door. The muffled sound of wind against shutters. And somewhere behind layers of stone and textile, a small pocket of warmth inside bed curtains. An attempt, as old as humanity itself, to create safety and rest in a world that could never be fully controlled. And in the next part, we'll move room by room through a typical castle night, starting with the great hall and the servants' quarters, then climbing toward the private chambers and the most secure spaces, so you can feel in a practical way how medieval architecture and medieval society shaped something as universal as sleep. As night settled more fully over the castle, the great hall gradually transformed from the center of daily activity into one of the main sleeping areas for much of the household. During the day, the hall had been filled with movement. Servants carrying food, messengers arriving, retainers discussing matters of work or defense. But by late evening, after the final meal and the quieting of conversation, the atmosphere changed. Tables were often moved aside or cleared, and the wide open floor became space for bedding. For many members of the castle household, sleeping arrangements were simple and temporary. Servants, guards, and lower-ranking retainers might bring out pallets, basic mattresses stuffed with straw or other inexpensive materials. These were laid directly on the floor, sometimes arranged in loose rows depending on how crowded the castle happened to be. Blankets were spread over the top, and personal belongings were kept close at hand. Privacy in the modern sense did not really exist here. Instead, people relied on familiarity and routine. Living and sleeping among many others was simply part of daily life. The hall's large fireplace remained an important source of warmth through the night. Before going to sleep, someone responsible for maintaining the fire would bank the embers carefully so that the heat would last as long as possible without creating danger. Castles were always aware of the risk of accidental fire. A blaze inside a stone fortress might sound manageable, but the internal structures, wooden beams, floors, furniture, and textiles, could burn quickly if flames spread. Managing fire safely was a constant responsibility, particularly once most of the household had gone to sleep. Even in sleep, the castle remained organized according to hierarchy. Those closest to the Lord's service often slept in positions nearer to doors or corridors that led toward the private chambers. Their proximity meant they could be summoned quickly if needed. Guards assigned to interior duties might rest lightly in the hall as well, prepared to respond to a disturbance at the gate or within the walls. In this sense, the Great Hall was not only a communal sleeping area but also a kind of nighttime readiness zone, where trusted members of the household remained within reach. Moving away from the hall, smaller chambers and corridors led toward areas used by specialized staff. Kitchens, storage rooms, and workspaces often had nearby sleeping areas for the servants responsible for those tasks. A cook or kitchen servant, for example, might sleep close to the hearths so that fires could be restarted early the next morning. Castles typically began their daily routine very early, sometimes before sunrise, especially during busy seasons of travel or agricultural activity on the surrounding lands. These servant sleeping spaces were usually modest. The rooms might be narrow with low ceilings and minimal decoration. Bedding remained simple, straw pallets, blankets, and sometimes shared coverings in colder seasons. Yet proximity to one's work area made life more practical. It allowed the castle to function smoothly each morning, as servants could quickly begin preparing food, cleaning spaces, and managing supplies before the higher-ranking residents of the castle even woke. Further up the staircases, the atmosphere gradually changed. As one climbed into the more private levels of the castle, sleeping arrangements reflected greater status and comfort. These upper chambers were not luxurious by modern standards, but compared to the hall or servant quarters, they offered relative quiet and separation. Thick wooden doors could be closed, tapestries hung along the walls reduced drafts, and fireplaces were more common in these spaces. The bedrooms of knights, high-ranking retainers, or important administrators might include permanent beds rather than temporary pallets. These beds were often wooden frames supporting mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool, or other softer materials. Linen sheets covered the mattress, and several blankets provided warmth through the night. Curtains around the bed frame were especially valuable here. They helped trap heat while also creating a small enclosed space that shielded sleepers from cold air circulating through the room. Although these chambers were more comfortable, they were rarely solitary spaces. Attendants or junior servants often slept nearby, sometimes on smaller pallets within the same room, or just outside the door in adjoining areas. Their presence ensured that assistance was always close at hand. If a fire needed adjusting, water was required, or a message had to be delivered quickly, someone would already be nearby to help. The higher one moved within the castle, the clearer the social structure became. Sleeping arrangements revealed exactly where each person stood in the hierarchy of the household. Comfort, warmth, privacy, and quiet increased step by step as one approached the most secure chambers at the heart of the castle residence. And it is there, in those inner rooms reserved for the lord and lady of the castle, where the medieval experience of sleep looked the most different from the communal life below. In the next section, we'll step inside those private chambers and explore how the most powerful residents of the castle prepared for the night. As we move deeper into the castle, past the busier corridors and the shared sleeping spaces of the household, we arrive at the most private rooms in the entire structure. The chambers reserved for the lord and lady. These rooms were not simply bedrooms. They were central spaces of authority, comfort, and controlled access within the castle. The lord's chamber was often positioned in one of the most secure parts of the residence, sometimes in the keep or in a well-protected wing of the castle complex. The route to reach it might involve climbing narrow staircases, passing through one or two smaller antechambers, and moving beyond doors that could be locked or guarded. This arrangement served both practical and symbolic purposes. It ensured security while also reinforcing the idea that access to the lord required permission and status. Inside the chamber, the furnishings were usually more refined than those found elsewhere in the castle. The bed itself was the centerpiece of the room. Unlike the straw pallets used in the Great Hall, this bed was often large, elevated on a wooden frame, and supported by a proper mattress filled with feathers or wool. Linen sheets covered the surface, and multiple blankets or fur coverings were layered on top. These materials were expensive and represented both comfort and wealth. Surrounding the bed were thick curtains suspended from a wooden frame or canopy. These curtains played a vital role in maintaining warmth. Even with a fireplace in the chamber, the surrounding stone walls could absorb much of the heat, leaving the air cool throughout the night. When the bed curtains were drawn, they created a smaller pocket of warmer air around the sleeper. In effect, the bed itself became a protected space within the larger room. Tapestries hung along the walls served a similar purpose. Although they were often decorated with patterns, scenes, or heraldic designs, their practical function was equally important. The heavy fabric helped block drafts and reduced the chill radiating from the stone. In winter months especially, these textiles made a noticeable difference in comfort. Despite these improvements, the chamber was rarely silent or entirely private. Attendants remained close by, even during the night. A trusted servant might sleep in a small adjoining room or on a pallet within the chamber itself. Their duties could include tending the fire, bringing water, adjusting bedding, or responding quickly if the lord required assistance. In a large noble household, the presence of attendants was not unusual. It was expected. Lighting in the chamber was kept minimal once the household settled for the night. Candles were valuable, and leaving them burning unattended posed a risk. Typically, a servant would extinguish most lights before sleep, leaving only the fireplace or perhaps a single controlled source of light if necessary. The result was a dim, quiet atmosphere shaped by shadows, firelight, and the occasional movement of servants passing quietly through nearby corridors. Even the most comfortable chamber in a medieval castle had its limitations. Windows, though sometimes fitted with shutters or early forms of glass, still allowed cold air to enter. During storms, wind could rattle the wooden shutters or whistle through narrow openings in the stone. In winter, frost might form along the edges of window frames. Thick blankets and enclosed beds helped, but the experience remained far colder than modern heated homes. Night routines in these private chambers followed familiar patterns shaped by medieval life. Before sleep, prayers were often said, either privately or with members of the household present. Religious practice played a significant role in daily rhythms, and nighttime prayer was a common way to close the day. Afterward, attendants might ensure the fire was safely arranged for the night and that doors were properly secured. Once the chamber quieted, the castle itself settled into a different rhythm. The busiest work had ended, but the building was far from inactive. Guards continued their watch along walls and gatehouses. Servants occasionally moved through corridors carrying messages or tending to fires. Somewhere in the castle, someone was awake, ensuring that the great fortress remained secure until morning. And as the lord and lady rested behind heavy curtains and thick stone walls, the castle continued its slow, steady life through the night, held together by routines that had developed over centuries of medieval living. In the next section, we'll explore another important aspect of castle life after dark: the guards, watchmen, and nighttime routines that protected everyone sleeping within those walls. While most of the castle's residents tried to rest, the night was also the time when some members of the household became most active. Security never truly paused in a medieval fortress. Even in peaceful regions, castles were symbols of authority and targets of opportunity. Theft, espionage, or sudden conflict were always possibilities, and the people responsible for guarding the castle understood that danger was most likely to appear under the cover of darkness. The gatehouse was one of the most critical locations during the night. By evening, the main gates of the castle were usually closed and secured with heavy wooden bars. The portcullis, if the castle had one, could be lowered as an additional barrier. Once these defenses were in place, access to the castle became tightly controlled. Anyone arriving after dark would need to announce themselves loudly and wait for the gate guards to investigate. These guards rarely slept deeply during their shifts. Instead, they worked in watches, taking turns staying alert while others rested nearby. A guard might sit close to the gate chamber with a cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders, listening carefully for unusual sounds outside the walls. Torches or lanterns provided limited light, casting long shadows along the stone passages of the gatehouse. Beyond the gate, other guards patrolled the walls. Castle walls were not simply static barriers. They were working spaces with walkways that allowed soldiers to move along the perimeter. At night, patrols moved slowly along these paths, scanning the surrounding landscape. In rural areas especially, the darkness beyond the walls could be almost complete, broken only by moonlight or distant fires from nearby villages. The guards relied heavily on their hearing. Footsteps, the movement of animals, or the faint sound of voices could carry through the night air. Even the rustling of trees might draw attention if it seemed out of place. While many nights passed quietly, vigilance was essential. A castle that failed to maintain watch could be vulnerable to surprise. Inside the castle walls, another quiet routine unfolded among the servants responsible for maintaining warmth and safety. Fires, especially those in major fireplaces, could not simply be left unattended. If a fire burned too strongly, it might create sparks that threatened nearby wood or textiles. If it burned too low, rooms would become uncomfortably cold by morning. Skilled servants learned how to bank a fire properly, arranging the embers so they would continue to produce steady heat through the night. In some castles, night watchmen also moved through interior corridors carrying lanterns. Their role was partly security and partly safety. They checked doors, ensured that candles had been extinguished, and watched for any sign of smoke or disturbance. A castle might contain hundreds of people at times, and even a small accident could create serious danger if left unnoticed. These quiet patrols also helped maintain order. Medieval castles were structured environments where every person had a place and a role. Movement through the corridors late at night could attract attention, especially if someone was found where they did not belong. The presence of watchmen discouraged theft, conflict, or other disruptions among members of the household. Meanwhile, in the sleeping areas of the castle, the night unfolded slowly. In the great hall, people shifted in their blankets as the fire dimmed and the air cooled. A servant might stir briefly to add a piece of wood to the embers. Someone might wake momentarily, listen to the distant call of a guard changing watch, and then settle back into sleep. Higher up in the private chambers, the experience was quieter but still connected to the rhythms of the castle. The thick curtains of a noble bed might block drafts, yet the distant sounds of footsteps in the corridors or the soft echo of a closing door could still travel through the stone walls. In this way, the castle at night functioned like a living system. Some people slept deeply, others lightly, and a few remained fully awake to ensure that the fortress remained safe and orderly until the first light of morning began to touch the towers. In the next section, we'll explore what mornings looked like inside a medieval castle, and how the household gradually woke from these quiet nighttime routines to begin another busy day within the stone walls. As the night slowly gave way to the first hints of dawn, the atmosphere inside the castle began to shift again. Medieval life followed the rhythm of natural light, and mornings often began earlier than many people today might expect. Long before the sun fully rose above the surrounding fields or forests, some members of the household were already awake, preparing the castle for another day. The first to rise were usually the servants responsible for the practical needs of the castle. In the kitchens, fires had to be revived from the embers carefully banked the night before. This was an important task. If the fire had gone completely cold, starting a new one could take considerable time and effort. By preserving the embers overnight, cooks could quickly build the flames back to life and begin heating water or preparing the first simple meals of the day. Water itself was another early concern. Castles did not have running taps, and water had to be carried from wells, cisterns, or nearby sources. Servants often began this work at dawn, hauling buckets through courtyards and corridors. The water was needed for cooking, washing hands and faces, cleaning surfaces, and sometimes for the personal needs of the lord and lady when they woke. In the great hall, where many members of the household had spent the night sleeping on pallets, the morning routine began with quiet movement. Blankets were folded, bedding rolled or carried away, and the open floor slowly returned to its daytime function. Servants swept away debris and refreshed the rushes or straw that covered parts of the floor. Within a short time, the same space that had served as a communal sleeping area during the night would once again be ready to host meals, meetings, and daily activities. Guards who had spent the night watching the gates or patrolling the walls began to change shifts as daylight approached. Fresh guards took their places while those who had remained awake through the dark hours were finally able to rest. This rotation was essential for maintaining readiness without exhausting the soldiers responsible for protecting the castle. Meanwhile, in the upper chambers, the waking process was more gradual. The lord and lady of the castle were often attended by personal servants who helped manage the morning routine. A servant might enter quietly to stir the fire back to life, allowing the chamber to warm slightly before the occupants fully rose from bed. Water would be brought for washing, along with fresh garments for the day ahead. The act of rising itself was not always rushed. Medieval mornings often involved moments of prayer or quiet reflection before the day's responsibilities began. Religious observance was deeply woven into daily life, and many households marked the start of the day with prayer, either privately in chambers or in a small chapel within the castle. Breakfast in medieval castles was typically lighter than the main meal later in the day. Bread, ale, cheese, or simple porridge might be served, depending on the household and the resources available. In large castles, servants coordinated these preparations carefully so that food was ready at the appropriate time for different members of the household. As the sun rose higher and light filled the courtyard, the castle returned to its familiar daytime energy. Messengers might arrive at the gate, craftsmen began their work, and servants moved quickly through the corridors carrying tools, food, or supplies. What had been a quiet fortress through the night gradually transformed back into a busy center of activity. Yet the patterns of the previous night still shaped the morning. The guards who had protected the walls were finally able to sleep. The servants who had risen earliest continued their work deep into the day. And in the private chambers, decisions made by the lord or lady would influence everything from local justice to the management of lands surrounding the castle. In this way, sleep in a medieval castle was never simply about rest. It was part of a larger cycle, one that connected the quiet darkness of night with the responsibilities and routines that defined castle life from dawn until evening. As the castle fully awakened and daylight spread across its towers and courtyards, the night's quiet routines faded into the background of a new working day. Yet the experience of sleep and the conditions surrounding it continued to shape the lives of everyone within the walls. Understanding how people slept in a medieval castle is really another way of understanding how they lived. For much of the household, sleep was closely tied to labor. Servants, craftsmen, and retainers often worked long hours during the day, and their rest was shaped by the practical demands of the castle's operation. Kitchens needed constant attention. Animals in nearby stables required feeding and care. Repairs to tools, weapons, and building structures were ongoing responsibilities. After such work, sleep was less about luxury and more about simple recovery. Even modest bedding could feel comfortable after a day of physical labor. At the same time, the castle was never entirely predictable. Visitors could arrive without much warning, especially if the castle sat along an important travel route or belonged to a powerful noble. Hosting travelers was an expected part of noble responsibility, and accommodating guests sometimes required quickly rearranging sleeping spaces. Servants might carry extra bedding into chambers or clear additional space in the hall. What had been a fairly routine night could suddenly become crowded and busy if a large group arrived before the gates were closed. Seasonal changes also influenced how sleep was experienced within the castle. During the colder months, managing warmth became one of the household's greatest challenges. Fires burned more frequently, and additional blankets were brought out from storage. People might sleep closer together for warmth, especially in shared spaces. Even the wealthiest chambers were not immune to winter cold. Frost could form along stone surfaces, and breath might be visible in the early morning air. In contrast, summer nights brought a different set of conditions. While castles remained relatively cool compared to wooden houses, enclosed spaces could still become warm and somewhat stale. Windows and shutters might be open to allow fresh air inside, though doing so required careful attention to security. Curtains around beds might be drawn back during warmer weather, trading some privacy and warmth for improved airflow. Another factor shaping sleep was the rhythm of medieval timekeeping. Without modern clocks in every room, people relied heavily on natural light, church bells, and daily routines to mark the passage of time. Dawn, dusk, and the ringing of bells from nearby churches or monasteries provided signals that structured daily life. These signals influenced when people woke, worked, prayed, and returned to bed. Inside the castle, bells could also mark important moments. Some castles had small chapels where religious services were held regularly. The sound of a bell announcing prayer might echo through corridors and courtyards, reaching even the more distant parts of the complex. For many residents, these familiar sounds helped maintain a sense of order and continuity from one day to the next. Children growing up within castles experienced these rhythms from an early age. Noble children were often raised under the supervision of nurses, tutors, and attendants who managed their daily routines. Their sleeping arrangements could be more comfortable than those of most servants, but they were still part of the larger household structure. Young pages or attendants in training sometimes shared sleeping spaces with other boys their age, beginning the gradual process of learning discipline, service, and responsibility. Over time, the daily and nightly routines of castle life formed habits that people rarely questioned. The cold of stone walls, the flicker of firelight, the distant footsteps in corridors during the night, these were simply normal parts of life. Medieval people adapted to these conditions with practical solutions. Heavy textiles, layered bedding, carefully managed fires, and organized sleeping arrangements that reflected the strict hierarchy of the household. What becomes clear when examining sleep in medieval castles is that comfort was never the castle's primary purpose. Castles were built first for defense and authority. Their thick walls, narrow windows, and towering structures were designed to withstand threats, not to create perfectly comfortable living environments. Every improvement in comfort, bed curtains, fireplaces, tapestries, was an adaptation within that larger defensive design. Yet, despite these limitations, castles were not merely harsh places of survival. They were vibrant centers of administration, culture, and social life. Music, storytelling, religious ceremonies, and gatherings filled the great halls. Diplomacy and decision-making took place in private chambers. Families lived, grew, and planned their futures within those stone walls. And each night, after the noise of the day faded and the gates were secured, the castle returned once again to its quieter rhythm. Fires were carefully arranged, guards took their posts, and hundreds of people settled into sleep according to their place in the household. Some slept on feather mattresses behind heavy curtains, others on simple straw pallets in shared halls. Yet together they formed a single living community within the fortress. Seen from this perspective, sleeping in a medieval castle was not simply a matter of beds and blankets. As evening approached once again, the castle gradually returned to the slower pace that marked the transition from day to night. Work in the courtyards and workshops began to wind down, tools were stored away, and animals were secured in their proper places. Servants carried the final supplies into kitchens and storage rooms, while the last visitors of the day either settled in as guests or departed before the gates were closed. The rhythm of castle life, which had been busy and noisy throughout daylight hours, slowly shifted toward the quieter routines of the evening. One of the most important moments in this transition was the closing of the gates. In many castles, this was a formal part of the nightly routine. As dusk deepened, guards prepared the heavy wooden doors of the gatehouse, ensuring that the mechanisms, bars, locks, and sometimes the iron portcullis, were ready to secure the entrance. Once the gates were closed, movement in and out of the castle became tightly controlled until morning. Anyone arriving late would have to call out to the guards and wait to be recognized before being allowed inside. Inside the walls, preparations for the night continued in many small ways. Servants checked fires in the main rooms and chambers, adjusting the logs so that warmth would last as long as possible without producing excessive smoke. Candles and oil lamps were used sparingly. Light was valuable, and fire inside a stone building filled with wooden furniture and fabrics always carried risk. For that reason, many lights were extinguished earlier than people today might expect, leaving the castle illuminated mainly by fireplaces and occasional lanterns carried through the corridors. The evening meal had already taken place earlier in the great hall. For the lord, lady, and honored guests, this might have been a formal event, with several courses and the presence of musicians or entertainers depending on the household's wealth. For the rest of the castle staff, the meal was simpler but still an important moment of rest after the day's work. Once the meal ended, the hall gradually emptied as people returned to their duties or prepared their sleeping areas. Before bedding was laid out, servants usually cleared the hall carefully. Tables were moved aside, food remnants were removed, and the floor was swept. Rushes or straw covering parts of the ground might be refreshed if necessary. These rushes helped absorb dirt and moisture and made the stone or packed floor more comfortable to walk and sleep upon. Maintaining them was part of the ongoing effort to keep the castle environment manageable despite the large number of people living there. As darkness deepened, the castle's atmosphere changed noticeably. The busy movement of the day faded into quieter sounds, soft footsteps in corridors, the shifting of bedding in the hall, and the occasional crackle from a fireplace. Guards began their watches along the walls and at the gatehouse. Their presence was a reassuring sign that the fortress remained alert even while most of its residents rested. Within the great hall, servants and retainers gradually settled onto their pallets. Blankets were pulled close, and cloaks were sometimes used as additional coverings. People often slept with their personal belongings nearby, both for convenience and for security. In such shared environments, trust was important, but caution remained part of daily life. Elsewhere in the castle, the private chambers became quieter as well. Attendants finished their final duties, adjusting bedding, bringing water, and ensuring that doors were properly secured. Once the lord and lady retired behind the curtains of their bed, servants withdrew to nearby spaces where they could rest while remaining available if needed during the night. Outside the castle walls, the surrounding landscape grew silent under the night sky. Villages nearby dimmed their fires, and fields lay dark and still. From the top of the castle towers, however, watchmen could still see faint shapes of roads, forests, or rivers illuminated by moonlight. Within those stone walls, hundreds of people slept in different conditions yet shared the same protective structure. The castle, built to withstand conflict and uncertainty, also served as a place where daily life continued, where people worked, gathered, and eventually rested at the end of each day. And as the night deepened, the castle settled once more into its familiar rhythm. Fires glowing softly, guards watching the darkness beyond the walls, and the quiet breathing of a household sleeping together inside one of the most distinctive living spaces of the medieval world. As the hours of night passed, the castle entered its deepest period of quiet. Most of the household had settled into sleep, fires had burned down to low embers, and only a handful of people remained fully awake. Yet even in this quietest moment, the castle was never entirely still. Medieval castles were complex environments, and the night revealed details of life that daytime activity often concealed. One of the most noticeable features of the castle at night was the movement of air through the structure. Thick stone walls protected the interior from attack, but they also created a network of cool drafts moving through corridors, stairwells, and small window openings. Even in well-furnished chambers, residents often felt the slow circulation of cold air during the night. This was one reason heavy textiles were so important. Tapestries, curtains, and bed hangings were not merely decorative elements. They were practical tools for managing temperature inside a stone building that could otherwise feel harsh and exposed. Sound also carried differently during these late hours. In the daytime, the noise of conversation, work, and animals filled the castle with constant activity. At night, Even the smallest sound could travel along stone surfaces and through narrow hallways. The distant step of a guard walking along the wall might echo faintly into the courtyard. A door closing in one chamber might be heard several rooms away. People sleeping within the castle grew accustomed to these sounds, learning which ones were ordinary and which might signal a problem. For those sleeping in shared spaces like the Great Hall, the experience of night was shaped by the presence of many others nearby. The steady rhythm of breathing, occasional shifting of blankets, or someone quietly rising to adjust their bedding formed part of the background of communal sleep. In such settings, people often learned to rest even when the environment was not perfectly silent or comfortable. It was simply the normal condition of living within a large household. Meanwhile, guards stationed along the castle walls continued their patient watch. Their work required attention and endurance rather than constant action. Most nights passed without incident, but vigilance remained essential. A guard might pause along the walkway, scanning the dark fields beyond the walls. Moonlight sometimes illuminated the surrounding landscape, revealing distant trees, roads, or small clusters of buildings belonging to nearby villages. These guards often communicated with one another through quiet calls or signals as they moved along their assigned sections of the wall. Such communication ensured that each area of the perimeter remained covered. In larger castles, multiple towers allowed watchmen to observe the countryside from elevated positions. From these towers, they could detect movement long before anyone approached the gate. Inside the castle, another small group occasionally remained awake, servants responsible for essential nighttime tasks. Fires had to be checked periodically to ensure they remained safe. In some chambers, embers were adjusted so that warmth would still be present when residents woke in the morning. In other areas, fires might be reduced further to minimize risk while everyone slept. Water vessels were sometimes refilled during these hours as well, particularly if the castle expected an early start the next morning. Preparing quietly during the night allowed the household to begin its activities smoothly at dawn. Medieval castles functioned best when routines were carefully managed, and nighttime preparation played an important role in maintaining that order. The castle chapel could also influence the rhythm of the night. In some households, especially those closely connected to religious traditions, prayers might be observed during late hours or very early in the morning. The presence of a chapel within the castle walls meant that spiritual life remained intertwined with daily routines. Even those who were asleep might occasionally hear the faint sound of a bell marking a moment of prayer. For many residents, the deepest part of the night offered the most peaceful sleep. The fires had stabilized, outside activity had ceased, and the castle had settled into its most stable state. Wrapped in layers of blankets or cloaks, people slept in conditions shaped by centuries of practical adaptation to stone architecture and medieval climate. Eventually, however, this stillness would begin to fade. The slow turning of time meant that dawn was always approaching. Long before the sun rose over the horizon, subtle changes would begin inside the castle once again. A servant stirring to check the kitchen hearth, a guard preparing to end his watch, or the faint glow of early light appearing at the edges of narrow windows. And with that gradual return of light, the great fortress, silent through the deepest hours of darkness, would once again prepare to wake, continuing the steady cycle of work, authority, and daily life that defined the medieval castle. As the final hours of the night approached, the castle rested in its most delicate balance between sleep and wakefulness. The deepest darkness had passed, yet dawn had not fully arrived. In this quiet stretch of time, the castle often felt almost suspended between two worlds, the ordered routines of the day and the guarded stillness of the night. Inside the great hall, the fire had usually burned low, leaving a bed of glowing embers rather than active flames. The warmth it produced was gentle but fading, and the air of the room had cooled noticeably compared to the evening hours. Those sleeping on pallets or straw mattresses pulled their blankets tighter or shifted slightly closer to the hearth's remaining heat. In such large stone rooms, warmth dispersed quickly, and the early morning chill could settle across the floor long before sunrise. The hall itself, which had served as a busy center of conversation and meals only hours earlier, now appeared almost unrecognizable. Bodies rested quietly beneath blankets, shapes outlined faintly by the soft glow of the embers. Personal belongings, boots, cloaks, small bags, remained close to each sleeper. For the people resting there, this arrangement was entirely normal. Living and sleeping among many others formed a shared rhythm that shaped daily life in medieval households. Elsewhere in the castle, corridors and staircases remained mostly empty. The torches that had lit these passages earlier in the evening were usually extinguished, leaving only faint firelight from nearby rooms to illuminate the stone walls. The architecture of the castle, its narrow turns, spiraling staircases, and heavy wooden doors, gave the nighttime interior a quiet, almost maze-like character. Moving through these spaces in darkness required familiarity with the layout and a careful step. Guards along the walls, however, remained alert. Their watch continued even during these quiet hours before dawn, when fatigue could begin to settle in. Rotating shifts helped prevent exhaustion, but standing or walking along cold stone walkways for hours required patience and discipline. Cloaks were pulled tightly around shoulders, and hands occasionally extended toward a torch or lantern for warmth. From the top of the castle towers, watchmen could observe the gradual change in the sky long before those sleeping inside noticed it. The blackness of the night slowly softened into deep shades of blue or gray. Stars faded one by one, and the outline of distant hills or forests became easier to distinguish. For guards who had spent the entire night on duty, these subtle changes signaled that the most demanding hours of their watch were nearly complete. Within the private chambers of the castle, sleep continued more comfortably. Behind bed curtains and heavy blankets, the lord and lady of the castle remained sheltered from much of the chill affecting the larger rooms below. The enclosed space of the curtained bed preserved warmth far better than the open hall. Even so, the temperature of the chamber could drop noticeably during the night if the fire was not carefully maintained. Occasionally, an attendant might wake briefly to check the fireplace or adjust a log to ensure a small amount of warmth remained until morning. These quiet tasks were performed with great care to avoid disturbing the chamber's occupants. Servants in noble households learned to move softly and efficiently, carrying out their duties almost silently within the dim light of the room. The castle's animals also contributed subtle sounds to the early morning atmosphere. Horses shifting in nearby stables, dogs moving within courtyards, or the faint rustling of livestock could sometimes be heard through open spaces in the walls or from buildings within the castle grounds. These sounds reminded listeners that the castle was not only a residence and fortress but also part of a working estate supporting agriculture, travel, and trade. As the sky outside slowly brightened, the first signs of waking life began to appear inside the castle. One of the earliest signals often came from the kitchens. A servant assigned to begin the day's cooking would rise before most others, returning to the hearth to rebuild the fire from the embers left overnight. The sound of wood being placed carefully into the fireplace, followed by the soft crackle of flames returning to life, marked the beginning of a new cycle of activity. Soon after, other servants began to stir. Water had to be carried, floors swept, and the hall cleared of bedding before the castle fully awakened. Guards returning from the walls exchanged brief words with those taking over the morning watch. In the upper chambers, attendants prepared for the moment when the lord and lady would wake and begin the day's responsibilities. Gradually, the castle moved from quiet rest toward motion once again. The early light filtered through narrow windows and arrow slits, casting long beams across stone floors and wooden tables. What had been a dark and silent fortress only an hour earlier now began to fill with footsteps, voices, and the steady energy of a working household. In this way, the experience of sleep within a medieval castle was never separate from the life of the building itself. Night and day formed a continuous cycle of preparation, vigilance, and routine. Even in the quietest hours before dawn, the castle remained alive, held together by the careful work of the people who lived, served, and protected it. And as the sun finally rose above the surrounding landscape, the fortress stood ready once again to begin another day. As morning light finally spread across the outer walls and towers, the castle completed its slow transition from night to day. The quiet stillness that had settled over the fortress during the deepest hours of darkness began to dissolve, replaced by the sounds of preparation and movement. For the people who lived inside these stone walls, this transition was not abrupt. It unfolded gradually, guided by routines that had developed through generations of castle life. The earliest activity almost always began in the service areas of the castle. In the kitchens, fires that had been carefully preserved overnight were built back into strong flames. Servants added fresh wood, adjusted the iron grates, and placed large pots over the heat. Water began to warm for cooking and washing, and the first smells of the morning, with smoke, heated grain, and baking bread, slowly filled nearby corridors. The kitchen staff worked quickly because their tasks supported the entire household. Even a modest castle could contain dozens of residents, while larger noble residences might house well over 100 people when servants, guards, craftsmen, and visiting guests were all present. Feeding such a community required organization and early preparation. What seemed like a quiet morning moment was actually the beginning of an enormous logistical effort that would continue throughout the day. In the great hall, servants moved carefully among the sleepers who had spent the night on pallets. Those waking earliest began folding blankets and gathering their bedding. The hall needed to be restored to its daytime function, and this transformation happened quickly. Straw mattresses were stacked or carried away, and the floor was swept clean of debris from the night before. Fresh rushes might be scattered across sections of the floor to absorb dirt and moisture, helping keep the room manageable despite the constant traffic of people passing through. The hall gradually returned to the familiar environment of daytime activity. Long wooden tables were brought back into place, benches aligned, and the great fireplace strengthened with new logs. Soon this same room would host conversations, meals, announcements, and work, continuing its role as the central gathering space of the castle. Outside in the courtyard, the change in atmosphere was equally noticeable. Stable workers and grooms began tending to horses that had rested through the night. Animals were fed, brushed, and watered in preparation for travel or daily work. Messengers might be preparing to ride out with letters or instructions from the lord of the castle, while farmers from nearby lands sometimes arrived at the gate seeking guidance, payment, or protection. The castle gatehouse once again became an important point of activity. After remaining sealed through the night, the gates were eventually opened under the supervision of guards. This moment symbolized the return of the castle to its public role within the surrounding community. Traders, villagers, and travelers might now approach, knowing that the fortress was awake and operating. Meanwhile, in the upper chambers, the waking process remained quieter and more controlled. Servants assigned to the lord and lady of the castle entered the chamber carefully, often carrying warm water for washing. The fireplace might be revived if the room had grown cold during the night. Curtains around the bed were gently opened to allow light into the space. The act of rising in noble households could involve a small sequence of routines. Washing, dressing, and preparing for the day's responsibilities required assistance from attendants who managed clothing, personal items, and the chamber environment. These routines were not simply matters of comfort. They also reflected the structured hierarchy that governed castle life. Once dressed, the lord or lady might begin the day with prayer in the castle chapel. Religious observance played a significant role in medieval daily routines, and the chapel within the castle served as an important spiritual center for the household. Attending prayer helped establish a sense of order before the practical demands of governance and administration began. Throughout the castle, people continued to emerge from their sleeping spaces. Guards who had stood watch during the night now finally sought rest, while fresh soldiers took their places along the walls. Craftsmen prepared tools, scribes organized documents, and servants carried messages between different sections of the castle. What is striking about this daily cycle is how closely sleep was connected to the functioning of the entire household. Sleeping arrangements were not simply about comfort or privacy. They reflected each person's role within the castle community. Servants slept close to their work areas so they could begin early. Guards rested near defensive points where they might be needed quickly. Nobles slept in protected chambers that reflected their status and responsibility. Even architecture itself reinforced this system. The thick walls, narrow corridors, and layered arrangement of chambers created clear boundaries between public and private spaces. As people moved through these spaces each morning, the castle's design guided their routines just as it had guided their rest during the night. By mid-morning, the castle was fully alive again. Sunlight illuminated the towers and battlements, voices echoed across the courtyard, and the smell of cooking food drifted through open doorways. What had been a quiet sleeping fortress only a few hours earlier now functioned as a center of administration, hospitality, and work. Over the course of many years, these nightly routines shaped the rhythm of life inside medieval castles so deeply that they became almost invisible to the people who lived there. For them, the experience of preparing for sleep within thick stone walls was simply part of the natural order of things. The chill of evening air creeping through narrow windows, the dim glow of firelight along corridor walls, and the steady presence of guards moving quietly through the fortress were not unusual events. They were the familiar background of everyday life. What makes castle sleep especially interesting to historians is how clearly it reflects the structure of medieval society. The castle was not only a residence but also a carefully organized community. Everyone inside it had a defined place, both socially and physically. Where someone slept was a direct reflection of their role within the household. At the center of this structure stood the lord and lady, whose chambers were positioned in the most secure and comfortable areas of the castle. Their sleeping spaces were protected by multiple doors, thick walls, and attendants who remained nearby. These rooms were warmer, quieter, and better furnished than most others in the fortress. The bed itself, with its curtains, blankets, and feather mattress, represented not just comfort but authority and status. Moving outward from these central chambers, the quality of sleeping arrangements gradually changed. High-ranking knights, administrators, and trusted retainers often had their own rooms or shared chambers with relatively comfortable beds. Their proximity to the lord reflected their importance within the castle's daily operations. Further still were the quarters of servants and workers who supported the household. Their sleeping spaces were simpler and often shared with many others. Pallets of straw, basic blankets, and the warmth of a nearby fire formed the essentials of their rest. These arrangements may seem austere by modern standards, yet they were practical solutions within the environment of a medieval fortress. The architecture of the castle reinforced this social structure. Private chambers were located deeper within the building, separated from busy public areas by staircases, corridors, and locked doors. Shared sleeping spaces, such as the Great Hall, remained closer to the center of daily activity. In effect, the castle itself acted as a map of medieval hierarchy. Yet despite these differences, everyone within the castle depended on the same protective structure. The thick walls that shielded the lord's chamber also protected the servants sleeping in the hall. The guards watching the battlements defended every person inside the walls, regardless of rank. At night, the castle functioned as a single community united by shared vulnerability and shared shelter. Another aspect often overlooked in discussions of castle life is how adaptable these spaces needed to be. Medieval households were rarely static. The number of people living within a castle could change quickly depending on travel, diplomacy, or seasonal events. Visiting nobles, merchants, messengers, or soldiers might arrive unexpectedly and require lodging. When this happened, Sleeping arrangements shifted accordingly. Extra pallets might be laid out in the hall. Guest chambers could be prepared in a matter of hours. Servants might temporarily share spaces that were normally less crowded. The flexibility of castle sleeping arrangements allowed the household to absorb sudden increases in population without disrupting the overall routine of the fortress. The experience of sleep was also shaped by the passage of time across the medieval centuries. Early castles, especially those built during periods of frequent conflict, were designed primarily for defense. Comfort was a secondary concern. Over time, however, as political conditions stabilized in some regions, castles began to evolve. Windows grew slightly larger, fireplaces became more common, and residential spaces expanded. These changes gradually improved sleeping conditions for the castle's elite residents. Bed chambers became more private, furnishings grew more elaborate, and attention to warmth and comfort increased. Nevertheless, the basic realities of stone construction remained. Even the most refined late medieval castle could never fully escape the cold, damp nature of its walls. Beyond the physical environment, medieval beliefs also influenced how people approached sleep. Night was often associated with vulnerability, both physical and spiritual. Darkness limited visibility, making it harder to detect threats, while religious traditions emphasized the importance of prayer and moral vigilance even during rest. For this reason, bedtime prayers were common in many households. Individuals or families might quietly recite familiar prayers before sleep, asking for protection through the night. Religious objects, such as small crosses or devotional items, might be kept nearby in private chambers. These practices offered reassurance in a world where uncertainty was a constant presence. Despite these concerns, medieval people did not necessarily experience nighttime as frightening. For those accustomed to castle life, the sounds of guards walking the walls, the steady glow of the hearth, and the presence of others sleeping nearby created a sense of security. The castle was designed precisely to offer that protection. As centuries passed, the experience of sleeping inside castles continued to evolve, shaped by changing architecture, shifting political realities, and the gradual transformation of medieval society itself. While early castles had been designed almost entirely for defense, later generations of builders began to place greater emphasis on comfort and domestic life. This did not mean castles suddenly became luxurious residences in the modern sense, but it did mean that the people who lived in them slowly found ways to make nightly rest more manageable. One of the most important changes was the growing emphasis on private living spaces. In earlier periods, communal sleeping was extremely common, especially among members of a lord's household who served in administrative or military roles. The Great Hall remained the social center of castle life, but over time nobles increasingly preferred separate chambers for sleeping and personal activities. These private rooms offered a level of quiet and privacy that had been difficult to achieve in earlier centuries. Architectural developments supported this shift. Builders began including more specialized rooms within castle designs, chambers connected by corridors rather than opening directly into shared spaces. Fireplaces were placed in more rooms, allowing warmth to spread beyond the main hall. Windows, while still narrow by modern standards, sometimes included improved shutters or small panes of glass that helped reduce cold drafts. Beds themselves also became more elaborate among the wealthy. By the later Middle Ages, noble households sometimes invested significant resources into bed furnishings. Wooden frames grew larger and more carefully carved, and curtains became thicker and more decorative. Feather mattresses, though expensive, were highly valued because they provided greater softness and insulation than straw or wool stuffing. For nobles, the bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a symbol of status and personal space within a crowded household. In some cases, important conversations or private meetings even took place in the bedchamber. Receiving trusted visitors in this room reflected a level of confidence and intimacy that would not be granted to everyone within the castle. Yet even as comfort improved in these private areas, most residents of the castle continued to sleep in simpler conditions. Servants, guards, and craftsmen rarely benefited from the architectural improvements designed for the upper ranks. Their sleeping spaces remained practical rather than luxurious. Pallets on the floor, shared rooms, and proximity to work areas were still common features of their nightly routine. Another factor that shaped sleep in castles was the changing role of castles themselves. During periods of intense warfare or political instability, castles were filled with soldiers and supplies, making space even more limited. Under those circumstances, sleeping arrangements could become crowded and temporary. Soldiers might sleep wherever space allowed, on benches, along corridors, or near defensive positions where they could respond quickly if needed. In more peaceful times, however, castles often functioned as administrative centers rather than purely military strongholds. Lords managed estates, hosted visitors, held courts, and organized the economic life of surrounding lands. These activities required a stable household, and with stability came greater attention to domestic comfort, including better sleeping arrangements. Still, no matter how refined the castle became, its fundamental design always reminded residents that it was built for protection first. Thick stone walls held cold air during winter months, and even well-furnished chambers could feel damp during long periods of rain. Wind sometimes slipped through small openings in shutters or around door frames. These conditions meant that medieval people continued to rely heavily on layered clothing, heavy blankets, and enclosed beds to remain warm throughout the night. Lighting also remained limited compared to modern homes. Candles and oil lamps were valuable resources, and they were used carefully to reduce the risk of fire. This meant that much of castle life after sunset occurred in dim light. For those preparing to sleep, this created an atmosphere that gradually encouraged rest. The fading glow of fireplaces and the quiet dark corridors signaled the end of the day's activity. For many castle residents, nighttime also brought a different emotional atmosphere than the busy hours of daylight. The castle might feel enormous and echoing when most people were asleep. Long stone hallways that were crowded during the day became silent pathways lit only by occasional lanterns. Guards walking the walls and watchmen moving through corridors were reminders that even in sleep, the castle remained alert. Despite these challenges, castles offered one great advantage over many other medieval homes: security. The walls, towers, and gates provided protection not only against military threats but also against bandits, wild animals, and other dangers common in the countryside. For the people living inside, this protection likely made the fortress feel reassuring at night, even if it was not always comfortable. Families raised children within these walls, servants spent their entire working lives there, and generations of nobles governed their lands from castle chambers. Night after night, people adjusted their bedding, banked the fires, and settled into sleep within the same familiar stone environment. As the medieval centuries moved toward their later stages, castles slowly began to change in both purpose and atmosphere. While many remained important defensive structures, some gradually took on a more residential character. Lords who had once needed purely military fortresses increasingly wanted homes that reflected stability, wealth, and refinement. These changes influenced not only how castles looked from the outside, but also how people experienced everyday life inside them, including something as ordinary as going to sleep. In earlier centuries, survival and defense had been the guiding principles of castle design. Thick walls, narrow windows, and compact internal layouts created buildings that were difficult for enemies to penetrate. But those same features made castles cold, dim, and sometimes uncomfortable as living spaces. As warfare evolved and political landscapes shifted, some nobles began modifying their castles to better support domestic life. One noticeable change was the growing attention given to interior living quarters. Additional chambers were constructed, corridors became more organized, and larger windows were occasionally added where security allowed. These windows sometimes contained small panes of glass, an expensive luxury at the time, or wooden shutters that helped reduce drafts. While such improvements might seem modest today, they made a meaningful difference for the people who slept in these rooms night after night. Bedchambers in wealthier castles became more carefully arranged as well. Furniture beyond the bed itself began appearing more frequently. Wooden chests for clothing, stools or benches, and small tables used for personal items. The bed remained the most important object in the room, but the chamber gradually became a place where individuals could spend quiet time beyond simply sleeping. The structure of the bed itself also reflected these changes. By the later Middle Ages, canopy beds with heavy curtains were common among the nobility. These curtains were thick and often layered, creating an enclosed space that trapped warmth and blocked the movement of cold air. Inside this small enclosure, the temperature could be noticeably warmer than the rest of the room. For people living in large stone buildings that rarely held heat well, this design made sleeping far more comfortable. Textiles played an enormous role in improving castle sleeping conditions. Blankets, furs, tapestries, and padded coverings all served practical purposes. Walls covered with fabric reduced drafts and softened the cold surfaces of stone. Thick blankets helped preserve body heat, and layered bedding allowed sleepers to adjust their comfort depending on the season. Even with these improvements, however, castles never lost their distinctive nighttime atmosphere. When evening fell, much of the building still became quiet and dimly lit. Candles were used carefully, and fireplaces remained the primary source of both warmth and light. As the household prepared for sleep, Servants moved through corridors, extinguishing unnecessary flames and ensuring that fires were arranged safely for the night. The closing of the castle gates remained a defining moment each evening. Once the heavy doors were secured and the portcullis lowered if one existed, the castle entered a controlled state of isolation. The outside world, dark fields, distant villages, and uncertain roads, was separated from the protected interior of the fortress. For the residents inside, this moment often brought a sense of reassurance. The walls that made the castle difficult to heat also made it difficult to enter without permission. Guards stationed at towers and along battlements ensured that any movement outside the walls would be noticed. Within those defenses, hundreds of people could rest knowing that the fortress was designed to protect them. Inside the castle, sleep still followed the patterns shaped by social hierarchy. Nobles retired to their chambers, where bed curtains were drawn and attendants remained nearby if needed. Knights and officials rested in rooms closer to the administrative center of the household. Servants and workers returned to their shared sleeping areas, spreading pallets in halls or small chambers near kitchens, storage rooms, or workshops. These arrangements were not only practical, they were also deeply familiar. Many individuals spent years, sometimes their entire lives, following the same nightly routines inside the castle walls. The placement of bedding, the management of fires, the sounds of guards changing watch, and the quiet echo of footsteps in stone corridors became part of a rhythm that rarely changed. Children growing up in castles learned these routines from an early age. Young members of noble families often slept under the supervision of nurses or attendants, while boys serving as pages began adjusting to shared sleeping spaces alongside others of similar age. Through these experiences, they gradually became accustomed to the responsibilities and expectations of castle life. In time, the cycle repeated itself countless nights. The castle would grow quiet, fires would dim, guards would take their positions, and the household would settle into sleep once again. Morning would eventually return, bringing new activity, decisions, and responsibilities within the same walls. Looking back across the centuries, it becomes clear that sleep inside medieval castles was shaped by a careful balance between defense, community, and daily necessity. These buildings were never designed purely for comfort, yet the people who lived within them constantly adapted their surroundings to create warmth, safety. As medieval castles continued to develop over the centuries, the experience of night within their walls remained a mixture of routine, adaptation, and quiet endurance. While historians often focus on battles, politics, or architectural features, the simple act of preparing for sleep reveals much about how people actually lived in these imposing structures. By evening, the entire castle began shifting toward its nighttime rhythm. After the main meal in the Great Hall, activity gradually slowed. Servants cleared away dishes and leftover food, benches were pushed aside, and the long wooden tables that had hosted conversation and announcements were moved to create space. What had been the central social room of the castle slowly transformed into a place of rest for many members of the household. The process was familiar and efficient. Bedding stored in nearby chests or storage areas was carried into the hall. Pallets filled with straw or wool were laid out across sections of the floor. Blankets and cloaks were spread on top, creating simple but functional sleeping arrangements. These spaces were rarely assigned permanently. Instead, people often settled in familiar spots according to custom or personal relationships with others in the household. In such shared environments, people developed habits that helped them sleep despite the lack of privacy. Conversations quieted quickly once the fire burned low. Some individuals wrapped themselves tightly in cloaks to retain warmth. Others kept boots or personal belongings within reach so they could move quickly if necessary during the night. The Great Hall itself played an important role in maintaining warmth. Its large fireplace remained the strongest source of heat in the castle. Even after the main flames died down, the stone hearth retained warmth that slowly spread into the surrounding space. People sleeping nearby often chose positions where they could benefit from this lingering heat. Yet warmth was never evenly distributed. Those closest to the fire enjoyed greater comfort, while sleepers farther away felt the cooler air circulating through the room. This uneven warmth reflected the realities of living inside a stone fortress where heating technology remained limited. Elsewhere in the castle, quieter sleeping arrangements unfolded in smaller chambers. Some rooms housed groups of servants responsible for particular tasks: kitchen workers, stable hands, or craftsmen. These individuals often slept near their work areas so they could begin their duties early in the morning. Such rooms were simple but practical. A small fireplace might provide limited warmth, while narrow windows admitted only faint moonlight during the night. Bedding remained basic, yet proximity to work made daily routines more efficient. When dawn arrived, these servants could quickly move into action without crossing the entire castle. Higher within the castle, sleeping spaces grew gradually more comfortable. Knights, administrators, and trusted members of the household often had access to permanent beds rather than temporary pallets. Their chambers contained heavier furniture and sometimes decorative textiles that helped reduce drafts. Still, even these rooms were rarely silent or isolated. Stone walls carried sound easily, and footsteps in nearby corridors could echo through the building. The creak of wooden doors or the faint call of a guard changing watch might drift into the chamber during the night. Over time, residents became accustomed to these sounds, recognizing them as part of the castle's normal life. At the very center of the residential areas were the private chambers of the lord and lady. These rooms represented the most comfortable sleeping spaces within the fortress. Curtains around the bed helped trap warmth, while thick blankets and feather mattresses created a softer sleeping surface. Even here, however, the environment remained distinctly medieval. Fireplaces produced warmth, but also smoke that sometimes lingered in the room. Windows allowed light during the day but could admit cold air at night. Servants remained nearby to assist with evening routines or respond if their master or mistress required something during the night. Despite these imperfections, the bedchamber offered a level of privacy and security that few other areas of the castle could provide. Doors could be closed, curtains drawn, and lights dimmed as the household settled into sleep. Beyond the walls, the countryside lay in darkness. Villages nearby extinguished their fires, and fields rested beneath the night sky. From the castle towers, Watchmen could observe this quiet landscape while continuing their careful patrols. Inside the fortress, hundreds of people slept under the same protective structure. Some rested comfortably behind heavy bed curtains, while others lay on simple straw mattresses near fading fires. Yet each person was part of the same living system that kept the castle functioning. Through these nightly patterns, castles revealed themselves not just as symbols of power or defense, but as places where ordinary human needs were met within extraordinary architecture. Every evening brought the same careful preparations: banking fires, spreading bedding, securing gates, and ensuring that guards stood watch. And every night, within those towering stone walls, a community of nobles, soldiers, servants, and children drifted into sleep together, trusting that the fortress surrounding them would carry them safely through the darkness until morning returned once again. As the castle settled deeper into the night, another aspect of medieval sleep became noticeable: the way time itself was experienced during the dark hours. Modern people often imagine sleep as a single, uninterrupted block, but medieval nights, especially inside large communal environments like castles, often unfolded differently. The rhythm of rest could be more fluid, shaped by the environment, the responsibilities of the household, and the simple realities of living within a fortress that never fully shut down. For many castle residents, waking briefly during the night was completely normal. A guard might pass through the hall to check a door. A servant might rise quietly to adjust a fire. Someone sleeping nearby might shift position or rise momentarily to visit a latrine located along an exterior wall. These interruptions were not necessarily viewed as disturbances in the way modern sleep interruptions often are. Instead, they were simply part of the natural rhythm of nighttime life. The layout of the castle played an important role in shaping these rhythms. Narrow staircases connected different levels of the building, often spiraling upward inside thick towers. Corridors were sometimes long and dimly lit, lined with doors leading to chambers of varying importance. Moving through these spaces at night required familiarity and caution. Those who lived in the castle for years learned its pathways almost instinctively, able to navigate even in very low light. Latrines, for example, were often placed in projecting sections of the wall or within small towers attached to the castle's exterior. These spaces allowed waste to fall away from the main living areas. While effective for sanitation, they also meant that someone leaving a sleeping area at night might need to walk through a corridor or climb a short staircase. In winter, the cold air in these spaces could be sharp and uncomfortable, reminding residents that the castle's design prioritized defense and practicality above personal convenience. In the quietest hours, the castle's sounds became especially distinctive. The wind moving across battlements could create a low, hollow tone through arrow slits or narrow openings. Wooden beams might shift slightly as temperatures changed. Occasionally, the distant bark of a dog or the rustle of animals in the courtyard stables carried faintly through the walls. For those accustomed to the environment, these sounds formed a familiar background rather than a cause for concern. The guards on duty remained the most consistently active presence during these hours. Their patrols followed regular patterns designed to ensure that every section of the castle's defenses remained observed. Some guards remained near gatehouses, while others walked along the curtain walls linking towers around the fortress perimeter. From these elevated positions, they could observe the surrounding land even in darkness. Moonlight, when present, helped illuminate the landscape. Fields, rivers, and roads sometimes appeared in soft silver light, making it easier for watchmen to detect movement. On darker nights, however, the countryside beyond the walls could become almost completely invisible. Under those conditions, guards relied heavily on sound and careful attention. Inside the castle, the private chambers remained the calmest spaces. Once the lord and lady had retired behind the curtains of their bed, the room often became still except for the quiet crackle of the fireplace. Bed curtains not only trapped warmth but also softened surrounding sounds, creating a sense of enclosure that helped encourage deeper rest. Attendants sleeping nearby were trained to remain attentive even while resting. If their master or mistress required something during the night, perhaps water, assistance with the fire, or the delivery of a message, they needed to respond quickly. This balance between sleep and readiness was common in many castle roles, where responsibilities could arise at any hour. Children living in the castle also adapted to these nighttime conditions. Young members of noble families often slept in chambers close to their caretakers, while boys serving as pages sometimes shared sleeping spaces with others learning the duties of service and discipline. Growing up within castle walls meant becoming familiar with the rhythms of both day and night life at an early age. Eventually, the quiet of the night would deepen once more after these brief movements and interruptions. Fires settled again into glowing embers, footsteps faded, and most residents returned to sleep. The castle, though never completely silent, entered its calmest state before the first hints of dawn began to appear. In those moments, the fortress stood almost motionless beneath the night sky. Its towers and walls, built to project strength and authority, also sheltered the simple human act of rest. Within its chambers and halls, people slept beneath blankets and furs, trusting the stone around them to guard against the uncertainties of the medieval world. And as the final hours of darkness slowly passed, the castle once again prepared, almost imperceptibly, for the return of morning and the busy life that would soon fill its corridors and courtyards once again. Still awake. While most residents slept, the castle's nighttime workers continued performing the tasks that allowed the entire household to function smoothly when morning arrived. These individuals, guards, fire tenders, and certain servants, were essential to the castle's stability, even though their work often passed unnoticed by those resting comfortably in their beds. In the gatehouse, the guards responsible for the entrance remained particularly alert. The gate was the most vulnerable point in the castle's defenses, and even during peaceful times it required constant supervision. A heavy wooden bar secured the door, and sometimes an iron portcullis stood lowered behind it. Within the gate chamber, lantern light flickered against the stone walls as guards kept watch. Their work involved long periods of waiting and observation. A guard might listen carefully to the wind outside, paying attention to any sound that seemed unusual. Hoofbeats on the road, voices in the distance, or the clatter of equipment could signal someone approaching the fortress. When such sounds occurred, guards often called out from the wall or tower to challenge whoever was outside the gate. Most nights, however, nothing dramatic happened. The surrounding countryside remained quiet, and the guards' watch passed in relative calm. Still, vigilance remained essential. The castle represented authority and wealth, and even small threats, such as thieves or wandering groups of armed men, could pose danger if the defenses were not properly maintained. Meanwhile, inside the castle, the servants responsible for fire management continued their quiet duties. In medieval buildings, fire was both essential and potentially destructive. Large hearths provided warmth and light, but if left unattended, they could also spread sparks that might ignite wooden beams or fabrics. For that reason, fires were carefully controlled throughout the night. In some rooms, embers were arranged to burn slowly so that warmth would remain until morning. In others, the flames were reduced further to prevent unnecessary risk. The servants assigned to these tasks moved through corridors carrying small lanterns, checking hearths and adjusting logs where necessary. These small nighttime routines ensured that the castle would not wake to freezing chambers or unexpected danger. Though the work required patience and attention, it helped maintain the delicate balance between warmth and safety inside the stone walls. In the sleeping areas of the castle, the atmosphere remained calm. The great hall held rows of sleepers wrapped in blankets and cloaks. Occasionally someone shifted position or murmured softly before returning to rest. The fading fire cast dim light across the room, creating long shadows that moved gently along the walls as the embers settled. In smaller chambers nearby, servants and workers slept close to their assigned areas. A kitchen servant might rest in a small room near the hearth so that the morning fire could be rebuilt quickly. Stable workers slept near the courtyard entrances, ready to begin caring for horses at dawn. Above these working spaces, the private residential rooms remained quiet and enclosed. The lord and lady slept behind the curtains of their bed, surrounded by layered blankets and warmed by the lingering heat of the fireplace. Their chamber represented the most comfortable sleeping environment within the castle, yet it still existed within the same stone structure that shaped the lives of everyone else in the household. From time to time, faint sounds from the outer walls reached these chambers, the distant call of a guard announcing the change of watch or the low movement of wind across the battlements. These sounds served as reminders that the castle remained awake in small ways even while most of its residents slept. Outside the walls, the landscape lay in deep darkness. Roads stretched through fields and forests that were barely visible under the night sky. Villages nearby had gone quiet hours earlier, their fires dimmed as families rested in their homes. From the height of the castle towers, watchmen could see this silent countryside stretching into the distance. The fortress stood like an island of stone rising above the surrounding land, its towers silhouetted against the stars. Within its walls, hundreds of people slept in different ways but shared the same protection. Some rested on feather mattresses beneath heavy curtains, while others slept on simple straw pallets near fading hearths. Yet each person depended on the same defensive structure, the same guards, and the same nightly routines that held the household together. And so, during these final quiet hours before dawn, the medieval castle revealed one of its most human qualities. Beneath the imposing towers and thick battlements was a community simply resting, protected by stone walls, watched over by patient guards, and waiting for the first light of morning to begin another day inside the fortress. As the darkest hours slowly began to fade, the castle moved toward the moment when night finally released its hold on the fortress. This transition did not happen suddenly. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost quietly, as the first subtle hints of dawn began to appear beyond the walls. For the guards stationed on towers and battlements, these early changes were the first signs that their long watch was nearing its end. Standing high above the ground, they were often the first to notice the faint light beginning to soften the horizon. The sky shifted slowly from deep black to a muted shade of blue, and the outlines of distant hills, forests, or fields gradually became visible again. The air at this hour was often the coldest of the entire night. Fires inside the castle had burned low, and the remaining warmth in large rooms like the Great Hall had faded considerably. Many sleepers instinctively pulled their blankets closer or shifted slightly in search of warmth. In the hall, the quiet breathing of dozens of people continued, accompanied only by the faint crackling of the last glowing embers in the hearth. Servants responsible for beginning the morning routine were often among the first to stir. These early risers had learned through experience that starting the day's preparations before the rest of the household awoke made their work much easier. Moving quietly through corridors with small lanterns, they began checking hearths and gathering materials needed to rebuild the fires. In the kitchen, this task was especially important. A castle kitchen relied on large hearths that required time to heat properly. By carefully stirring the embers left from the night before and adding fresh wood, a skilled servant could revive the fire quickly. Soon the first flames would begin to rise again, bringing warmth and light back into the room. As the fire grew stronger, the kitchen gradually filled with the familiar sounds of morning work. Iron pots were placed near the heat, water was carried in buckets, and preparations for the day's food slowly began. Even a simple breakfast required coordination when so many people lived inside the castle walls. Meanwhile, the great hall began its transformation once again. Those sleeping on pallets started to wake as the faint morning light filtered through narrow windows or doorways. People stretched, gathered their belongings, and began rolling up bedding so the room could return to its daytime purpose. Servants worked quickly to clear the floor. Straw mattresses were stacked or carried away, blankets folded, and the space swept clean of dust and debris. The long tables that had been pushed aside the night before were moved back into place, ready for the day's meals and gatherings. Outside in the courtyard, the earliest activity came from the stables. Horses that had rested through the night began shifting in their stalls as stable workers arrived with feed and water. The soft sounds of hooves against wooden floors and the rustling of hay drifted through the cool morning air. Soon the castle gatehouse also stirred back to life. Guards who had remained awake through the night exchanged brief words with those arriving to take the morning watch. Once daylight was strong enough, the heavy gates were prepared to open again. This moment symbolized the castle's return to its daytime role within the surrounding region. When the gates opened, the outside world gradually reconnected with the fortress. Farmers, messengers, traders, or travelers might approach the entrance, knowing that the castle household had awakened and that daily life was beginning once more. Within the upper chambers of the castle, the morning routine unfolded at a slower pace. Servants assigned to the lord and lady entered quietly to rekindle the fireplace and prepare water for washing. Curtains around the bed were gently drawn aside to allow light into the room. The transition from sleep to wakefulness in these private chambers was often calm and unhurried. Unlike the servants already busy throughout the castle, the noble residents typically began their day with a more measured routine. Prayer, dressing, and the first quiet discussions of the day's matters often took place within the bedchamber or nearby rooms. By the time the sun finally rose above the horizon, the entire castle had returned to life. Fires burned brightly again, footsteps echoed through corridors, and voices filled the courtyard. What had been a silent fortress only a few hours earlier was once again a busy center of activity. Looking back across the entire cycle of night inside a medieval castle, it becomes clear that sleep was only one part of a much larger rhythm. Every evening the gates closed, fires dimmed, and bedding was spread across halls and chambers. Guards took their positions, servants completed final tasks, and the household slowly settled into rest. Then, with the arrival of dawn, the process reversed itself. Fires were revived, rooms cleared, and the castle prepared to face the demands of another day. Behind the dramatic image of towers and battlements, the true life of a medieval castle was built on these simple repeating patterns: work, rest, vigilance, and renewal. Night after night, generation after generation, people found sleep within those stone walls, trusting the fortress around them to guard their rest until morning returned once again. As daylight strengthened and the castle fully awakened, the quiet world of the night seemed almost distant. Yet the routines that had shaped the dark hours continued to influence how the castle functioned throughout the day. The way people slept, where they rested, and how the fortress was managed overnight all reflected the deeper structure of medieval life inside those walls. For many residents, the castle was not simply a place of residence but the center of an entire working system. Lands surrounding the fortress produced grain, livestock, and other resources that supported the household. Messengers carried instructions between villages and neighboring estates. Craftsmen repaired tools, weapons, and household objects that were used every day. All of these activities depended on the steady cycle of work and rest that took place within the castle. Sleep played a crucial role in maintaining that balance. A guard who had spent the entire night walking the battlements needed rest during the day before returning to duty the following evening. Servants who rose before dawn to prepare fires and meals often found moments later in the afternoon to recover their energy. Even the lord and lady, whose responsibilities included managing lands and settling disputes, relied on a predictable routine of rest to maintain their authority and decision-making. The structure of the castle itself helped organize this cycle. Certain rooms and spaces naturally shifted their function depending on the time of day. The Great Hall, for example, might serve as a meeting place during the morning, a dining space in the afternoon, and a shared sleeping area by night. The ability of a single room to transform in this way reflected the practical needs of medieval households. where space was valuable and every area had to serve multiple purposes. Other parts of the castle remained more consistent in their function. The bedchambers of the lord and lady, once prepared for sleep in the evening, also served as places for private conversation and administrative planning during the day. Trusted advisors might meet there to discuss political matters or estate management, reinforcing the importance of the chamber not only as a place of rest, but also as a center of authority. The same was true for many other rooms. A servant's sleeping area near the kitchens allowed early access to the hearth each morning. A guard's resting place near the gatehouse ensured quick response if a visitor arrived unexpectedly. The castle was designed so that each person's sleeping location supported their role within the household. Seasonal changes also influenced how these routines unfolded. In winter, nights were longer, and fires required more careful attention. Extra blankets were brought from storage, and people sometimes slept closer together to conserve warmth. Morning preparations began later when the sun rose slowly over cold landscapes. During summer months, the pattern shifted slightly. Longer daylight hours allowed more activity in the evening, and the warmer air made sleeping conditions somewhat easier. Windows and shutters could be opened to invite fresh air into the chambers, though always with awareness of security. Despite these seasonal differences, the overall rhythm remained remarkably steady. Each evening the gates closed, the household gathered for food, and servants prepared sleeping areas. Fires were banked, lanterns dimmed, and guards began their watch. Gradually the castle quieted as hundreds of individuals drifted into sleep within the protection of its walls. Then, as dawn approached, the process began again. Fires were revived, bedding cleared away, and the fortress returned to its daytime energy. This cycle repeated not just for days or months, but for years and generations. Over time, countless people experienced these same routines. Noble families raised children within the castle chambers. Servants devoted their working lives to maintaining the household. Soldiers and retainers stood watch over the walls through countless nights of calm and occasional tension. For all its imposing architecture, the castle was ultimately a place shaped by ordinary human habits. Beneath towers designed to resist siege and battlements meant to project strength, life followed the familiar needs of warmth, food, community, and rest. Sleeping in a medieval castle, therefore, was never simply about lying down at the end of the day. It was part of a carefully organized system that allowed a large and complex household to function. The placement of beds, the management of firelight, the watch of guards, and the routines of servants all worked together to create a fragile but reliable order inside the fortress. And perhaps that is the most revealing image of all. When darkness settled over the countryside and the castle gates closed for the night, the fortress did not become a silent monument of stone. Instead, it became something far more human, a protected shelter where a community of people, bound by hierarchy and responsibility, found rest beneath the same roof while the medieval world slept beyond its walls.